In this section of the course, we are going to be configuring our database for our recipe project. We are going to start with an overview of the architecture that we are going to set up for the project. The database we are going to be using is Postgres. Postgres is a very popular open source database that's available for free. You can use it in both personal and commercial projects at no cost. Django comes with built-in support for Postgres and is all documented in the official Django documentation. It's one of the officially supported database options you can use with Django. We are going to be using Docker Compose to configure our database for our project. So this will allow us to define the database configuration inside our actual project source code, which means it's reusable for other developers who might be working on the project, or if we want to shift from one machine to another, and it's also reusable for our development environment. When we use Docker Compose, we can set up something called persistent volumes. This just means that our database keeps its data even after we stop the container. So unless we choose to delete the data ourselves, it stays saved. This is really helpful during development because it means you don't have to re-enter your sample or test data every time you restart the project on your computer. Docker Compose also takes care of network configuration, so you don't have to worry about manually opening ports or setting up connections. Everything can be managed through your Docker Compose configuration file, making it easy to define how services communicate with each other. Finally, you have the environment variable configuration. This also is a feature of Docker Compose, and this allows us to configure our settings inside the project using environment variables. I'm going to show you how you do this a bit later in the course. So, how is this going to look for our project? Well, we are going to have Docker Compose, and Docker Compose is going to have two different services, the database service and the app service. So the database is going to run the Postgres application and the app is going to run our Django application. These two services will be able to communicate with each other, allowing the Django app to read from and write to the Postgres database. So, how do we set up network connectivity? Well, this is handled automatically by Docker Compose. What we are going to do first is set the depends on option, which is a setting in Docker Compose. This ensures that one service starts before another. In this case, the depends on configuration makes sure the database service starts before the app service. However, there are a few things we will need to address later in this section. Because even if the service starts, it doesn't necessarily mean the database is fully ready to accept connections. We will cover that in more detail in a dedicated video about handling database readiness. Docker Compose automatically creates a network between the different services. In this case, a network is set up in the background that connects the app service and the database service, allowing them to communicate with each other. This means the app service can use DB as the hostname to connect to the database, since it's the name of the service running the database container. In Docker Compose, you can simply use the service name as the host name when connecting between services. It will all make more sense once we set up and configure the database later in the section when we talk about volumes. It's free time, so here's a joke for you. Why didn't the app talk to the database right away? Because it was still waking up. Depends on wasn't enough emotional support. So volumes is how we store persistent data using Docker Compose. This allows us to map a directory inside the container to a directory on our local machine. That way, we can choose when we want to clear the data in the directory. In other words, no matter how many times you start or stop your services, the data will remain persistent and can be reused each time until you intentionally choose to clear it. The way we use volume is by setting up what's called a name volume. And that means we are going to define a volume in the volumes block at the bottom of the Docker Compose configuration file. Then we'll use that name to map a directory inside the running container to the name volume on our local machine. So we are going to map the volume to the location inside the container where the database stores its data. Any data created by the database is actually written to the file system, and we are going to persist that specific system location by storing it in a named volume. If you check the official Postgres documentation or the Docker Hub page for the Postgres Docker image, you will find the exact path where the data is stored. That's how I determined which location we need to map to our volume because it's clearly documented there. So that's an overview of the database architecture we are going to be using. Curious how to set up a database to your Django app in Docker? That's exactly what we'll cover in the next lesson.